What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtonette. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over the teams that I think are the dark horse contenders in the SEC. Really, I think more of these teams are more of contenders for making the college football playoff. I think in terms of who's going to win the SEC this year, I think it's a pretty short race between a few teams. I'll talk more about those teams in my next video, but in this one I want to go over the dark horse teams. Before I do, though, if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But let's dive right into it. First of all, I think there's a couple teams maybe on the outside of this group. One in particular that I talked about in the last video, Auburn. I think if they can get the pieces put together on offense, I think they have a solid defense that'll take some steps forward this year. And I think they are on that fringe territory, especially with their schedule of being a dark horse contender. But the team first that I'm going to start things out with going over is the Texas A&M Aggies. And I know what most of you are saying, what I myself am saying for the most part is, well, don't we hype them up every offseason? And they have a season like they did last year where they finished 7-6. And I'm with you there, but I don't think they're going to be fighting for bowl eligibility as much as the teams that I went over in the last video. I think they're, out of all these teams, probably the most in that middle territory. I think they'll finish with a winning record. They'll make a bowl. And I think really it's just a matter of if they can get over that kind of 8-win plateau. Obviously, new head coach Mike Elko is coming in. He has 12 starters who are coming back, 6 on offense, 7 on defense. Leading the way is quarterback Connor Weigman, who had a 92 Pro Football Focus grade, which was number 4 nationally and first in the SEC. He revitalized the Aggies offense in 2022. He missed some time last year due to injuries. And speaking of injuries, there's a huge loss for this Aggies offense, and that's Reuben Owens, who is out for the season. Like C.J. Baxter from Texas, suffered an injury that took away his entire season in fall camp. So that's a big blow for the Aggies. They do, however, have a couple of other options at running back. Amari Daniels and Le'Veon Moss both combined for over 1,000 rushing yards last year. So those two guys together still ran for 1,000 yards. So yes, Owens is a big loss, but I think those two guys will fill that hole nicely. Another loss for them is wide receiver Evan Stewart. He's gone to Oregon. He had 514 yards, and among the returners was the leader with 4 touchdown receptions. But they're still going to have a trio of receivers that make up the number 29 returning passing offense from last year. Noah Thomas, Jade Walker, Moose Muhammad III, and this offense also was number 24 in scoring. So the offense, I think, is in good hands for Texas A&M. Elko shouldn't have too much of an adjustment there. Defense as well. They were a top 40 defense last year, number 13 against the rush, 19 total. Edge Nick Scourton from Purdue is kind of their top newcomer. He was the Big Ten leader in sacks last year with 10. He's also going to pair with both of the Shamars, both Turner and Stewart on the defensive line. Both of those guys combined for 7.5 sacks and 12 tackles for loss. Sophomore linebacker Torian York is kind of an emerging star on the Aggies defense. He had 74 tackles last year. And then safety Bryce Anderson leads the secondary, which is the unit with the most turnover. They did fairly well against the pass last year. They ranked 37th, so again, in that top 40 category. Really outside of their pass defense, they were more of a top 20 or maybe top 30 defense. Their pass defense dragged them down a little bit. They also didn't do a great job of creating turnovers, just -2 turnover margin last year. So that'll be something that can definitely be improved if they hope to compete at a higher level. Again, obviously Elko is the main story, I think, for this A&M team. They're going to have a home game against Notre Dame to open the season. They're at Florida, home against Missouri, at LSU, at Auburn, and home against Texas. Looking at this team right now, I think they do, even in the first year of a new head coach, take a step forward this year. I think they probably finish 8-4. I think their ceiling is probably right around maybe 6 or their floor, is right around 6-6. I think with this schedule, I think both of the road games that they have are winnable, Florida and Auburn. I could see them losing either of those. I don't think they lose both. And then those 4 home games against those opponents. I think the toughest one there is Texas, but that could be an opportunity to potentially knock their rival Longhorns out of the playoff race late, although I expect the Longhorns will be in pretty comfortable position heading into that one. Coming up next is the Oklahoma Sooners, the first of the teams that I'm going to be going over coming in to the SEC from the Big 12. I'll talk about Texas in the next video. The Sooners were 10-3 last year, 7-2 in the Big 12, and like A&M, they bring back 12 starters, 4 on offense, 6 on defense. And the question is, can the defense live up to the Brett Venables hype? Obviously, at Clemson, Venables was Dabo Swinney's defensive coordinator and led the Tigers' defense to heights that were really unequaled by most teams during that period. The question is, though, can he create that at Oklahoma? Last year, the passing defense was almost there. They ranked 17th, but then they were 42nd against the rush, 46th in scoring, and 77th in total defense. Their two main guys that are going to lead that is linebacker Danny Stutzman. He's a 3-year starter, 267 total tackles and 28 tackles for loss over those 3 years so far. He is somebody who, not so much in like his personality or even so much his style of play, but in terms of his efficiency and effectiveness, is reminiscent of Brian Bosworth, who was obviously infamous in the Sooners defense and was a phenomenal player. And I think he kind of has shades of that as an OU linebacker. Then in the secondary, defensive back free safety Billy Bowman was second nationally with 6 INTs and had 3 of those returned for a pick 6. He is an electric playmaker and ball hawk in the secondary, and he is a huge piece of this Sooners defense and a big reason why they had that top 20 ranking against the pass. Also, a couple of key guys to watch. Defensive end Ethan Downs was a second All-Big 12 second team All-Big 12 selection last year, and then a freshman defensive tackle David Stone is the top defensive lineman recruit for Oklahoma and also the first 5-star since Gerald McCoy came into Oklahoma back in I think the late 2000s or maybe early 2010s. So that is a player certainly to watch. Offensively, this was the unit that thrived for the Sooners last year. They'll have to make some adjustments, though, ranking 3rd in total, 4th in scoring, 6th in pass, and 7th in the rush. So overall, a top 5. Not many offenses across college football had that level of consistency across both pass, rush, scoring, and total offense. They're going to have sophomore Jackson Arnold come in for Dylan Gabriel. Arnold had a little bit of a rough bowl game last year in the Alamo Bowl against Arizona, but he'll be helped along by some experienced wide receivers in Nick Anderson and Deion Burks. And then in the backfield, running back Gavin Sawchuk had 5 straight games to end last year where he rushed for over 100 yards. And he'll be joined by a 5-star true freshman, Taylor Tatum, who is rated as one of the top, if not the top, running back coming in this 2024 class across college football. Their schedule, though, I think is probably perhaps second toughest in all of college football. I talked about Florida's both in the last video and in another video earlier this offseason. I think the Sooners have a really, really tough slate. They're home against Tennessee early on. They're at Auburn, obviously the game against Texas at the Cotton Bowl, at Ole Miss, at Mizzou, home against Bama, at LSU. I really think it's going to be tough for these Sooners to get through that slate with fewer than 2 losses. I would have them finishing right around 8-4. I think their ceiling is that 10-2 mark, which would certainly be good enough, I think, to get them into the playoff this year. 9-3 is kind of fringe, especially against this schedule, but I do project them to go 8-4 and being just outside of that. I think with this schedule, the floor is probably only 7-5. I think they have the talent to do well in the SEC this year. I just think they lose some of those games, especially in some of those really tough SEC road environments that they haven't really seen as much in the Big 12. Next up is the Tennessee Volunteers, 9-4 last year, 4-4 in conference, a little bit of a step back from their really good 2022 season. 8 starters coming back, 5 offense, just 2 on defense. And I'm going to start with the defense. I think a lot of what people talk about is the phenom quarterback Nico Iamaleava, but I think what needs to be talked about more is this defense. They were really, really underrated last year, but like I said, with that amount of starters coming back, just 2, they're going to be completely retooling, reloading this defense. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be key to watch for the Volunteers because they were kind of like a top 25 overall defense last year. Their guys to watch are defensive end James Pierce and then defensive tackles Omari Thomas and Omar Norman Lott. The big part of the change, really, the defensive line is the unit that's experienced for this group. Outside of that, There's a lot of turnover. Linebacker coach Brian Jean Mary left to Michigan. Washington co-defensive coordinator William Inge is in to coach those linebackers. They do have some good transfers coming in the linebacker unit, and they're also going to have leading tackler Elijah Herring back there. But the secondary lost 11 players, I believe, last year to the transfer portal or to graduation. So that's going to be a completely new look unit there. Offensively, again, it's the quarterback, Iamaleava, who really took apart, dissected Iowa's defense in a 35-0 bowl win. He's going to have receivers Squirrel White and Brew McCoy coming back this year, and then an Oregon transfer who had transferred in 2022, but will be getting more of an opportunity this year, Dante Thompson. And then running backs who were actually a top 10 unit last year in terms of yards per game, Dylan Sampson is the starter there. They're a little bit shallow behind him, but overall this top 25 offense should be able to continue most of what they did last year. Their schedule is certainly easier than Oklahoma's, although they do travel to the Sooners, to Norman, to face Oklahoma. They're going to be playing against NC State in Charlotte, I think week 2. I talked about that game actually in a video by itself because I think that game could decide which of these teams is in the college football race late in the season. Again, at Oklahoma, home against Florida, home against Alabama, and at Georgia. They avoid Texas and Ole Miss, and even LSU actually as well. I think avoiding all 3 of those teams will be big for the Volunteers. I think a reasonable projection for this team is right at 9-3. That's what I'm going to go with for the Volunteers. I think against this schedule, 10-2 is probably the ceiling. I think really 8-4 is probably the floor. So not a big range for this team. I'm going with 9-3 right there in the middle, right in the sweet spot. Next up is LSU, 10-3, 6-2 in conference, 13 starters, 6 on both offense and defense. They have one of the most experienced and probably one of the best offensive lines in college football. That's led by left tackle Will Campbell, who has gone 15 straight games without allowing a sack. Behind that line will be quarterback Garrett Nussmeier, who threw for 395 yards in the ReliaQuest Bowl win over Wisconsin. They really took apart the Badgers defense in that one. Stepping up for receivers Brian Thomas and, of course, Malik Neighbors, top 6 pick, is Kyron Lacey. He had 30 receptions last year, almost 19 yards per reception average and 7 touchdowns. And then a 1,000-yard receiver, C.J. Daniels, transferring in from Liberty. They were, I would say, almost undoubtedly the top offense in college football last year, certainly in the SEC in terms of numbers where they ranked. They had the number 1 scoring and total offense, number 3 passing, and number 10 rush. And kind of leading the way with the rush is Josh Williams at running back. Defensively, there were a lot of issues last year, and the question is, can Blake Baker coming in from Mizzou help lead some of those changes, really to fix a unit that ranked, if not the worst in the SEC, certainly near the bottom. I imagine Vanderbilt ranked worse than they did in many areas, but they're going to need to fix those things. Linebacker Harold Perkins was a freshman All-American in 2022, but took a step back last year. Of course, a step back. Still was able to get 5.5 sacks last season. And then Greg Penn III is the team's second leading tackler. The question is, who's going to step up elsewhere? You look at those linebackers, they're experienced for the Tigers, but who's going to step up both on the defensive line and in the secondary? Kind of the guys who are coming back with valuable starting experience last year are defensive ends, Savon Jones, cornerback Zy Alexander, strong safety Major Burns, and free safety Sage Ryan. In terms of their schedule, they're against USC in Las Vegas week 1, at South Carolina, home against UCLA, home against Ole Miss, at Texas A&M, home against Alabama, and home against Oklahoma to wrap up the season. I think that's a bit of a tough schedule. It's not as tough as Oklahoma's or Florida's in this conference, but it's probably up there, maybe 3rd or 4th toughest in the conference. I expect them to go also 9-3, I think, to match Tennessee. And overall, I think the Tigers are kind of right in that playoff conversation. I think there's going to be quite a few teams from different conferences that finish 9-3 and are going to be fighting for 1, maybe 2 spots to get into the college football playoff. Next up, another one of those teams that I think I probably see going 9-3, the Missouri Tigers. They were 11-2 last year, 6-2 in conference. I believe out of these teams I've gone over, they have the most experience returning. 14 starters, 8 offense, 6 on defense. They had a top 40 offense last year. They lose Cody Schrader, running back, who was an All-American selection, but they bring back the electric duo of Brady Cook at quarterback and Luther Burden III at receiver. Cook threw for 3,317 yards and 21 touchdowns. 1,200 of those yards and 9 of those touchdowns were to Burden. They also have their number 2 and 3 wide receivers coming back this year, Theo Wease Jr. and Mookie Cooper, and they also have 3 offensive linemen. Another guy who caught a lot of passes last year and has experience as a starter is tight end Brett Norfleet. This team had a plus 10 turnover margin last year and a top 30 defense. Defensive end Johnny Walker Jr. leads on the defensive line. And Georgia transfer Darius Smith will be tasked with trying to replace some of that production that Darius Robinson had last year for the Tigers. That'll be quite the tall task for Smith, but he does have some of that experience playing at a contender in Georgia. Linebacker Chuck Hicks is entering his 7th season. And then in the secondary, cornerback Toriano Pride Jr. comes in from Clemson. And then the star position, Dalen Carnell, he had 6 pass breakups and a pick 6 against Tennessee. He's kind of an all-SEC candidate to be selected to that. Their only real tough games are at Texas A&M, at Bama, and home against Oklahoma. They have really, to me, an easier schedule than most. They avoid Georgia, Ole Miss, Texas, Tennessee, and LSU. 5 of the teams that, along with Mizzou, are probably in the top 7 in this conference. So that is going to be big for the Tigers. I know I said 9-3 when I introduced them, but kind of looking over that again, I think 10-2 is a reasonable projection. I really think with that schedule, I guess a floor would be 8-4, and that's if they get upset somewhere. But I really think 9-3 is probably the floor, and I would say 11-1 is probably the ceiling. I think they probably lose one of those road games against Bama or A&M, and I think probably lose the game against Oklahoma as well to finish 10-2. But that rounds out my dark horse contenders. With Mizzou finishing 10-2, I think out of these teams, because of their schedule, they're the top contender to compete in the SEC. In terms of talent, I would probably go with Oklahoma barely. I think it's really going to be helpful for them that they host Tennessee, but I think outside of that game, their schedule is just too tough for them to compete. I think, again, talent-wise, I think the Sooners are right there. I just don't think they're going to be able to get through that slate without a few bumps in the road that'll take them out of SEC contention. But those are my thoughts on the SEC dark horses. Let me know in the comments below who you think is the dark horses, who has the best chance from the outside looking in to win the SEC. But that's all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burnett, signing out. Peace.